Welcome to video number 4, and we're continuing initialization of records. The second mechanism for initializing the fields of a record includes the concept called a constructor. So whenever you hear the word constructor, always think its goal or its purpose is to initialize. So let's take a look at our original declaration for our data type, and in it we merely define what the fields were. Now we're adding things, and let's look at what we've added. We've added a name, and this name happens to match what the struct name is. The moment we see the left paren, it says this thing looks like a function. And if it looks like a function, I can put parameters in here, or I can leave it empty. And what we have is a constructor. Here's some clues for the constructor. Let's talk about what's missing. What's missing is we have nothing over here. Normally we say you must have a return type. With the constructor, the first rule is there is no return type. The second rule is the name of the constructor is the same as the name of the data type. So this is what we call the default constructor, and it basically says you don't pass it any values to use in the initialization. It can either do nothing, so it is possible for us to say open set brace, close set brace, nothing in between, where the constructor does nothing. That is possible. It's called an empty block. Or we can initialize values. So the default constructor does what? It sets the names to empty strings, year to 1, average to 0, grade to X. Alright? And let's take a peek at what it's like to use the constructor. Alright? First of all, if I declare S1 and that's all, by default I am using the default constructor. That is, you don't have to do anything special to use the default constructor. Let's take a second look. We notice that for S2 we seem to be wanting to initialize the last name and the first name, but nothing else. That is, when we create this variable, we want to pass to the creation process, which is the constructor, we want to pass it 2 strings and nothing else. The third example here seems to say we want to pass all 5 values. We want to declare S3 and initialize it to be this data. Right? And the last thing that I note is that if your data type has a constructor, then the only way to initialize is by use of constructor. That is, I cannot initialize S3 using an initialization list. So let's go back and see what the other 2 constructors look like. The second constructor says you can set the value of the last name and the first name. So the last name you want to use and the first name are being passed to you at the time you declare the variable. Right. And then we're setting year to 2, average to 0, and grade to question mark. The last constructor is a fully initializing constructor because you provide 5 pieces of data. You're providing a value for each and every field. Now let's talk about this. I said that this behaves like a function in that you can pass arguments to it. Typically the arguments are going to be passed by value. So I'm providing a value for the year in parameter Y, value for last and first names, etc. Alright? So let's look at this again and say, what do we expect to see? We expect the default constructor to set grade to X, average to 0, year to 1, and empty strings for the first and last name. The second constructor, oh by the way, I have 3 constructors. The fact that I have 3 things that have the same name is called overloading. Overloading is permitted because if you look at the parameters, they're totally different. 0 parameters, 2 parameters, 5 parameters. Based on that, the compiler can tell which is which. So what we're going to do now is compile and run this, and we're going to see what is in these 3 strings based on the constructors. So let's do it. All right. And as we expected, let's go up and take a look. Let's get a little closer. We expect that the default constructor says year is 1, empty string, 0, and x. That's what we said we wanted to do. Okay. Second time, the constructor is doing what? We have John Doe that we initialize and nothing else. That's the second constructor. We set the year to 2, average grade to that. And finally, we have the fully initializing constructor. All right, let's do something before we go. Let's change the default constructor to where it does nothing. What does that mean? I can just kill these 2 lines. Oops, get back in here. We can compile. And let's run it again and see what we get. So notice what happens. If I do nothing, I will just take default values. So we have a garbage here and we have a garbage here. This stands for the float, not a number, which means you have bad data that can't be a decimal number. All right. Okay, I think with that we've gotten the principle across. With structs, there's 2 ways to initialize variables. One is with an initialization list. The other is with a special function called a constructor. If your data type has a constructor, the constructors must be defined as part of the struct statement. And a constructor looks like a function, but it does not have a return type. Its name must be the name of the data type. Thirdly, a constructor is only used at the time that you declare a variable. Instead of an initialization list, you just put you pass the values that you want to use as arguments that appear next to the variable name. So when I use the constructor down here, the fact that I have a parenthesis when I'm declaring says I want to use a constructor. The fact that I have a parenthesis says I want to use a constructor to initialize. Okay, and that's all with that. Our last video, very briefly, is going to be arrays of record.